That said, thank you all for coming today, and let me begin this session on New York stories. Well, I mean, New York is, needless to say, a city with many, many stories, and I probably won't be the first person, if you can panels today, for Ken to mention the article in the Times today, which about the fact that over 800 languages are spoken in New York City by people from all over the world, in places you never imagined existed in the world. New York is, of course, a place where America looks out at the world, and probably more importantly, it's where the world has come into America and made America what it is, though then often America forgets New York. It's a sort of displaced place, even sort of sketchy place, which I think we kind of like it that way. We have here today to talk about stories about New York four distinguished writers in the flesh, from near and far, who all have New York City connections of various sorts, living and writing about it. We have Colm Tóibín on the left, far left, my left, your right. He's, of course, born in Ireland. He's the author, most recently, of Brooklyn, a book about New York, but also The Master and The Blackwater Lightship, among other novels. And he's also the editor of the New York Stories of Henry James, which was published in the New York Review Books classic series, which I edit. We have Darryl Pinckney, to my left, author of High Cotton, a novel, and Out There, a New York Review Books, and we've just edited the New York Stories of Hardwick, which will be coming out shortly, which you can get copies of today at Hardwick. And then to my right, Roxana Robinson, author of 3 collections of short stories, 4 novels, most recently Cost, as well as a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe, and the editor of the New York Stories of Edith Wharton. And then Quim Monzó, to the right, who is an essayist and author of numerous short stories and novels from Barcelona, and an English translation by Mary Ann Newman of his novel Gasoline, which appeared in 1984 and which is set in New York, very visibly a New York of the early 80s, against undergoing a kind of exciting mental collapse. That's the way the early 80s were kind of like. That has just been published by Open Letter Press in translation by Mary Ann Newman on the far right, director of the Catalan Institute at NYU, also affiliated with the Institute Ramon Llull in Barcelona, who will interpret insofar as it's needed. It's not clear that it's much needed, for Quim Monzó. There are, along with these 4 distinguished writers who are living, 3 writers here with us in spirit. Henry James, who was born in New York in 1843, and who spent much of his youth here. Edith Wharton, who was born in New York and spent her youth and much of her adulthood before actually finding Edith to live in Europe, in New York. And much of his work is focused on New York. And finally, Elizabeth Hardwick, who was born in Kentucky and but came to New York as a young woman to study at Columbia and then spent the rest of her life here. She married Robert Lowell, and of course was a distinguished critic, novelist, and short story writer in her own right. We have, if you take this view as a division between, in effect, provincial New Yorkers. James is especially interested in New York as a kind of as a province. It's simply set aside from the world, a place insufficient in the world. Wharton is fascinated by affluent New York, and in its own way that is, and maybe was, and maybe remains a particular kind of province. And then on the other hand, we have Hardwick representing people who come from elsewhere to New York looking for new things, looking to find out about the world. And she said it was a Darryl, her dream was to be a New York Jewish intellectual. And similarly, we have finally Quim Monzó, who is still with us mostly, but who is also represents coming from elsewhere to look at New York and to write about New York. And thought what we would do is start from the beginning of this interrupted and complicated story, that is to say, with James, and proceed chronologically, and in a curious way we get a kind of time-lapse image of things, of some of the things, obviously, not all of them by any means, that New York has meant for writers, and that the different writers can talk both about the writers' work they have read and collected, but also their own relationship to that, and their own work insofar as it relates to New York City as well. So they will speak for a while, and then I may pose some questions, and after that there will be some time for questions from the audience. And so that's the plan for the evening. Thanks again for coming and talking later.
Let's start with Henry James. He's chronologically the first one. It's strange, perhaps because of his rootlessness, or perhaps despite his rootlessness, that he considers himself to be a native of New York. They came effectively to live in the city, at least you remember the city, from the age of 5, from 1848, when the family purchased a house on 58 West 14th Street. And they lived in the city until 1855, so in other words, he stayed in the city altogether for those 7 years, aged between 5 and 12, and he considered these years. When more than half a century after he left the city, when he came to write his memoirs, he remembered those years absolutely vividly. The names of teachers, the names of streets, the things they did in the streets. And for him there was a sort of sanctity around naming the streets, or naming the experiences from those years. And he talked about that house in West 14th Street. The place was to become for me forever so long afterwards, a sort of anchorage of the spirit. And later, when he went back there, he described the demolition of his grandmother's house in Washington Square as that it had amputated half my history. And there's a sense with James in these years, and in these 7 years, of someone living a great, uncomplicated life in what he viewed as a very simple place. And afterwards, when he left, 2 things happened. His life became more complicated, and New York, effectively, as far as he's concerned, was utterly destroyed. So you're looking at a very complicated issue, which we must look at, I think, with considerable nuance, because the astonishing attacks he made on New York throughout his life are not ordinary. The sense also he conjures up of that idyllic period before the city was destroyed. There's a sense where we can read that almost at that idyllic period before something in him was destroyed. I suppose we're talking about when the family was all together in one place, when the father wasn't dragging them around Europe. Even in those memoirs, he has to actually tell lies a number of times, because he just cannot bring himself to describe a number of times his father made the family across the Atlantic Ocean, or what his father called in a wonderful term. He was seeking greater sensuous education for his children in Europe. I must say, when I was growing up, I wish they had thought about my sensuous education. It would have sort of helped enormously. When he began as a writer in Europe, he became conscious of the amount of fun he could have at the expense of Americans. And in his book on Hawthorne, in 1879, he can list the things that don't exist for the American writer. We can talk about no sovereign, no court, no personal loyalty, no aristocracy, no church, no clergy, no army, no diplomatic service, no country gentlemen, no palaces, no castles, nor manors, nor old country houses, nor parsonages, nor thatched cottages, nor abbey ruins. He goes on, no cathedrals, nor abbeys, nor little Norman churches, no great universities, nor public schools, no Oxford, nor Eton, nor Harrow, no literature, no novels, no museums, no pictures, no political society, no sporting class. And he wondered how a novelist could possibly sort of thrive in this place. And obviously he got into great trouble about this, and William Dean Howells had a considerable amount to say about it, and said if it is not provincial for an Englishman to be English or a Frenchman to be French, then is it not so for an American to be American? James, of course, which is marvellous, because he could cause further offence now by saying, I think it is extremely provincial for a Russian to be very Russian, a Portuguese, very Portuguese, for the simple reason that certain national types are essentially and intrinsically provincial. So we're sending a message home to William Dean Howells, just in case he was interested. And the strange thing is that the inside of some of those buildings for James remains sacred space. The inside of his grandmother Walsh's house in Washington Square, as the inside of his grandmother James's house in Albany, where he places Isabel Archer in the second chapter of Portrait of a Lady, where Mrs. Touchett finds her exactly in the rooms, precisely described, that James knew in his grandmother's house in Albany. And so too, in the novel Washington Square, at a time when he was formulating ideas of seamlessness in the novel, where a novel should not be interrupted by the novelist, where the idea of character or architecture, that those ideas in the novel were for him to be supreme. He very strangely interrupts his novel Washington Square to say, I know not whether it is owing to the tenderness of early associations, but this portion of New York appears to many persons the most delectable. It has the kind of established repose which is not a frequent occurrence in other quarters of the long, shrill city. It has a riper, richer, more honourable look than any of the upper ramifications of the great longitudinal thoroughfare, the look of having had something of a social history. It was here that your grandmother lived, in venerable solitude, and dispensed a hospitality which commended itself alike to that infant imagination and the infant palate. It was here, and he goes on to sort of interrupt his own novel as stating a claim to this space not as belonging to Catherine Sloper and her father in the novel, but belonging to Henry James, the novelist who's writing the novel. It's a unique moment in his fiction where he actually enters stage middle and stands there for a minute, because there's something he desperately needs to explain, that this world is his world, and because this world is his lost world. And also, of course, in Washington Square, he begins what becomes a general assault on New York and its manners in the years after the death of his grandmother, in the years after their departure from the city. He describes Arthur Townsend as one of the young men in Washington Square talking. He said that he's buying a new house. It's only for 3 or 4 years. At the end of 3 or 4 years, we'll move. That's the way to live in New York, to move every 3 or 4 years. Then you always get the last thing. And this is sort of, there's a constant business of insult, heaped on insult. For example, in the story, The Impressions of a Cousin. It opens as the narrator wanders in the city and wonders how she could possibly inhabit 53rd Street. When I turn into it from Fifth Avenue, the vista seems too hideous. The narrow impersonal houses with the dry, hard tone of their brownstone, a surface as uninteresting as that of sandpaper, their steep, stiff stoops, giving you such a climb to the door, their knottish balustrades, porticos, and cornices, turned out by the 100, and adorned with heavy expresses, such an eruption of ornament and such a poverty of effect. And he has it in really for everywhere he goes, including also, we might mention, the people. What people? The people in the Fifth Avenue? They are even less Victorian than their houses. I don't perceive that those in the 6th are any better, or those in the 4th and 3rd, or the 7th and 8th. Good heavens, what a nomenclature. The city of New York is like a tall sun in addition. The streets are like columns of figures. And he goes on, as he he then comes to write his book, The American Scene. And in his book, The American Scene, he describes the immigrants in the city in a way which is, nothing pleases him in the city. It's as though people have arrived, these new people, they're almost like plague locusts. The consummate monotonous commonness of the pushing male crowd moving in its dense mass. He's talking about the immigrant in New York. This is in the early years of the 20th century. He's writing this book in about 1905. The immigrant in New York resembles, for the time, the dog who sniffs around a freshly acquired bone, giving it a push under the lip, betraying a sense of its possibilities, but not, and quite a sort of positive, deep tremor of consciousness directly attacking it. Of the Jewish population, there are small, strange animals known to natural history, snakes or worms, I believe, who, when cut into pieces, wriggle away contentedly and live in the snippet as completely as in the whole. So the denizens of the New York ghetto, heaped as thick as the splinters on the table of a glass door, had each like a fine glass particle, his or her individual share of the whole hard glitter of Israel. And if you think that's bad about the Jews, you should hear what he has to say about the Irish. And you should hear what he has to say about the Italians. And just in case you think he liked something, particularly hated Central Park, compared to an actress in a company destitute, to an epidemic or some other stress of all feminine talents. So that she assumes Central Park, she assumes on successive nights the most dissimilar parts and ranges in the course of a week, from the tragedy queen to the singing chambermaid. He hates the accents people speak, this terrible town. He describes it, people talking, as the torture room of the living idiom. And so it goes on. And the interesting thing is that one of the last sort of great stories he wrote, which was set in the city, is the story of the Jolly Corner. And the Jolly Corner gives us some sort of key to what was actually biting Henry James throughout his life about the city of New York. Because in it he imagines a figure, very like himself, who has actually been left, who has held on to a building in the city over all the years he travelled, has had it cleaned and kept bright, but his ghost lives there. And to some extent, James's ghost continued to live in the city, those years aged between 5 and 12, in a way that for most novelists and for most writers, the idea of childhood, holding on to childhood, of the way dust was on wood, of the way stairs creaked, of the way people spoke, of the way we woke in the morning, of sounds and smells, those things for novelists are absolutely crucial. There is an idea that one could suggest that when a novelist grows up, a novelist dies. It makes it very difficult to live with. But the idea constantly of eroding this element of the self, which most people can let go or hardly remember or not bother much with. For novelists, it's a stock in trade. We live on the creak of that stairs, age 7, the grandmother's arriving. And for James, the destruction of that, the watching, as each time he came back to the city, that something or other that was precious not only to him, to himself as a citizen of the world, but to something that mattered more to him, was essential to his life as an artist, had been destroyed in the name of materialism, in the name of progress, in the name of vulgarity, in the name of a century for which he had very little time. He would die in 1916. What's strange, just to conclude, this is a strange story because almost every time the city is mentioned throughout his fiction, and then in his book, The American Scene, he has it in for New York in a very special way. And this requires very close examination, in the same way perhaps as his relationship to George Eliot requires very close examination, or his relationship to his Irish background, or his relationship to his sexuality, or to his family. All of these relationships are very difficult and tormented relationships in which which is not easy to say one thing is true, because the opposite is often also true. And what's very strange is in the years between his writing of the American Scene in 1905 and his writing of his memoirs 5 years later, what he does in the next 5 years is he recreates his entire canon. And he produces what he thinks is going to be this huge bestseller. He always wanted a bestseller. He wanted to, as he said, to get the measure of the great flat foot of the public, as he called it. He almost failed to do this. And, but he was going to produce a large edition of his work in more than 20 volumes. And he wrote to his publisher, because he wanted a name for these. They weren't just to be the collected works of Henry James, he wanted a name for the edition. And he wrote, if a name be wanted for the edition, he wrote in 1905, for convenience and distinction, I should particularly like to call it the New York edition. After all you said about the city. If that may pass for a general title of sufficient dignity and distinction. My feeling about the matter is that it refers the whole enterprise explicitly to my native city. Up to then, people have used his wonderful head with his native city that he lived. His native city was inside his brain, was his prose style, to which I have had no great opportunity of rendering that sort of homage. And he hadn't been rendering homage in actually the content of the work, but somehow in his dream life, in the way he imagined himself, the city that he remembered, the ground in which his imagination first began to thrive, those streets, Union Square, Washington Square, Fifth Avenue, Sixth Avenue, that remained for him the most homeless of people, a sort of home, and a sort of place that mattered enormously to him, which perhaps explains in some way, but not in every way, why he heaped such a large number of insults on it in his fiction.
It's very interesting listening to this story about Henry James because there are some very strong similarities between the two writers. And I think all writers really start off feeling like outsiders, and that's part of why we all write, because we're trying to reconcile some feeling of marginalization and some feeling of not being at the center of things, but there are different reasons that everyone has. Edith Wharton was born, it would seem, right into the center of New York. She was part of a very Mandarin, deeply privileged social circle that depended on really the length of time that your family had been in this country more than on wealth. Her father came from an old family but not a rich one. Her mother came from a very old, very rich family, but she wasn't rich. So they were kind of caught, and her mother, Lucretia Rhinelander, she was one of the poor Rhinelanders, was an incredible snob, very much focused on the rules and the etiquette of formal behavior, and dedicated to this belief that as a Rhinelander, she was entitled and privileged to live like, she should be the best person in New York. She should receive the most invitations. She should be the queen, but she didn't have the money, and she didn't marry a man who had really enough money for her vaunting social ambition. The man she married was a very pleasant, courteous gentleman, something of a scholar and intellect. But he wasn't really rich. They had money enough so that he didn't have to have a job, but not enough to succeed where Lucretia wanted. And so Edith was brought up within this feeling of incredible constriction between these two forces. One was her mother's sense of snobbery and entitlement, and and the second was the absence of enough wealth. There was nowhere that she could go to get outside these two sets of rules. And so what happened to her was, Lucretia was an amazingly powerful snob, and she carried out her snobbery on her daughter as well. And there were many, many, many rules that governed social behavior. And when Edith finally married, and she had her own house in Newport, one of the things, the social activities of the day was to go out driving in your carriage. You had a driver, and you sat in the back. And Edith had a new carriage driver, and he didn't recognize her mother's carriage until they passed it on the street. And her mother was furious about this. And so Edith wrote her a note of apology and said, "I'm so sorry. I had a new driver. He didn't recognize your carriage." And her mother wrote back and said, "You could have stopped him." So there was this absolute set of adamant rules of behavior that she grew up with, Edith. And there was really no other way to live, as far as she could tell. There wasn't a bohemian circle. This was in the last 3 decades of the 19th century, or none she had access to. And it wasn't yet the time when New York was filled with abstract painters and modern dancers. And, you know, the wave of modernism had not yet broken. So she was trapped. She was also trapped because she was an intellectual, she was not rich, and she was not a beauty. So she didn't have a wave of admirers who were offering her a new world. She was not a success in the world that she had to live in. She came out into society early, a year early, because of her parents' financial problems, and in order to get her married off. And she was not a success at that. She didn't get married for 6 years, till she was 23, which is an old woman. And she married somebody 12 years older than she was, not rich, still living with his mother and his father in an insane asylum. So he wasn't attached. It wasn't a brilliant match. And they weren't really well suited to each other. I don't think they were really in love with each other at all. But she was trapped again, having been trapped in her parents' life. She was now trapped in her own life in New York. So for many years, she started writing before, her first published stories were in the 90s. And so what we know of Wharton, it starts off with this rage at the world she was living in, rage at the social strictures, rage at the moral codes, and rage at the architecture. She hated the architecture of New York. The family had moved to Europe when she was young because they had lost a lot of money in the Civil War, so they rented their properties here and moved to the continent to save money. And so while she was a child, she had a French governess and a German governess. She learned European languages, and she fell in love with European cities, which have grand boulevards and crescents and beautiful architecture. And she was outraged by the fact that she learned that in New York, somebody had made a decision among the city planners of New York, and they had decided not to make it look like Washington with beautiful boulevards and architecture. They wanted it to be populist and democratic, and every single plot would be the same size, and every single street would be straight, and the angles would all be right, and all the houses would look alike. And that drove her crazy. So there are comments like James's about how dreary and deadly the architecture in New York is. She felt that very strongly, the sense of the brownstone boot on the city of New York. And then they went back to Europe when she was in her teens, and so she knew young people in Europe. So she was always longing to get back to a sense of beauty and possibility that she had found in Europe. So she starts off with these stories that are about constriction and the restriction of the individual. Her first published story is a very charming one called Mrs. Manstey's View, and she goes outside her social circle and writes about somebody who is much poorer than she is and who lives a very narrow life and who looks out in the backyards of sort of tenement buildings and learns that she's going to be deprived of even her tiny, miserable view of backyards where there's a little wisteria and plants that come up in the spring, and she loves to look at it, and she finds that somebody's going to build something there. It's like Jane's. She feels it's a desecration of the tiny bit of nature that's left in New York. This is in 1891. They were already feeling that way. So there is this sense of the destruction of the landscape that New York is responsible for, and then also this incredible social constriction. And we see it very strongly in her great, great novel, House of Mirth, which comes out in 1905, but that's when she's been married unhappily for about 15 years. She got married in 1885. But there's, so this is an early story, A Cup of Cold Water. This is a description of a ball that the narrator goes to, and it's a description of this very rigid world that she lives in which social standing means everything, but money is behind it. So it's a dance of connection between money and social standing. To the girls in Miss Talcott's set, the attentions of a clever man who had to work for his living had the zest of a forbidden pleasure. But to marry such a man would be as unpardonable as to have one's carriage seen at the door of a cheap dressmaker. Poverty might make a man fascinating, but a settled income was the best evidence of stability of character. If there were anything in heredity, how could a nice girl trust a man whose parents had been careless enough to leave him unprovided for? So you have a sense of this world in which there are no options. If you're not rich, you didn't inherit money, you really are not going to be able to move into the world that you want moved into. And Edith knew that very well from her mother, who had to go to her own coming out party in a borrowed dress and shoes that were too tight for her. And she never forgot. And so this is a constant theme, this sense of social restriction. But very quickly, there's a sense of emotional restriction as well, and Wharton felt that very strongly. So there's a brilliant story called A Journey, early on, about a woman who's traveling back to New York by train with her invalid husband. And it's a fascinating study in a really subversive view of a woman, and it reminds me very much of the wonderful Kate Chopin story, Story of an Hour, in which a woman thinks her husband has been killed in a train crash. And it is, there is no room in this story for the traditional sense of a woman. She is a bad wife. She is a woman who has been deeply disappointed by her marriage, deeply disappointed by the fact that her husband has been transformed into a stranger. And she understands that in some way they are hurrying towards his death. And it's something she can't bring herself to fear. And it's an incredibly powerful, very modern story that reveals this sense of restriction that she finds. And then a little later, this is a description of the landscape in New York, the one that she hates. The day was radiant. This is from The Reckoning. The day was radiant, metallic, one of those searching American days, so calculated to reveal the shortcomings of our street cleaning and the excesses of our architecture. The streets looked bare and hideous. Everything stared and glittered. So again, you have a sense of her being trapped in a city that she really despises. And then she runs into real trouble. Her husband becomes more and more ill. It's clear that something's happening, maybe like what happened to his father. He's becoming insane. He then has affairs, public affairs, and then embezzles her money. And she finally, despite the very strong social restrictions, she finally gets a divorce. And she is very well aware of what that's going to mean in her life, in the New York world that she knows. Divorce is anathema. There's really no way to get around it. And so she writes the brilliant story, Autre Temps, about a woman who was divorced years earlier and has gone to live in disgrace in Florence and comes back to New York because her daughter has gotten divorced and remarried, and she thinks, she realizes that things have changed in New York, and she hopes that she will be restored to grace. but this doesn't happen. But this is a description of the New York world, the benefits of it, the luxurious plenitude of this elegant Mandarin world. She's in her daughter's country house in Massachusetts. When the door closed, she continued to stand motionless in the middle of her soft, spacious room. The fire, which had been kindled at twilight, danced on the brightness of silver and mirrors and sober gilding, and the sofa towards which she had been urged heaped up its cushions in inviting proximity to a table laden with new books and papers. She could not recall having ever been more luxuriously housed, or having ever so strange a sense of being out alone under the night in a wind-beaten plain. And that's what Wharton does so brilliantly, is juxtapose this very powerful sense of physical luxury with a sense of terrible emotional poverty. So she is now feeling not only the constriction of New York, but the terrible end of her marriage and her end as a sort of a card-carrying member of this Mandarin circle. That's 1911, and then she moves to New York, she moves to Paris, gets a divorce in Europe because it's more discreet, and moves to France and lives there for the rest of her life. And she writes the brilliant but utterly soulless book, Undine Spragg, Custom of the Country, which I think is, as I say, brilliant, but it's horrifying as a novel. It's not a great novel because there's no heart in it, no compassion. But she was desperate at that point, and she was filled with rage at what she was doing. She was really destroying something that she took very seriously, and so she wrote about it, the heartlessness of a woman that would do that. She moves to Europe, and then a number of years pass. The First World War takes place, and in the 20s, she starts doing more or less what Henry James did. She starts looking back at New York, the New York she grew up in, and it has changed for her. And she now sees it in a very different light. She thinks of it as a place where, instead of being cold and heartless and simply governed by mindless arbitrary rules, it becomes a place of great dignity. And she says at one point that she wrote to a friend, I've been spending time in the 19th century. It's a place of great nobility. It's like an old cathedral, she says. So her feeling completely changes, and she starts looking at it, and that's when she writes one of her two great novels, I think, The House of Mirth is one, and The Age of Innocence is the other, in which she sees those rules and those restrictions, instead of being ones that simply violate the rights of the individual, as rules that protect the community, the family, and the tribe, and the marriage, the institution, at the expense of the individual. So she now sees it as a great, generous, larger moral imperative. And she writes in 1934 another brilliant story called After Holbein, in which she looks back at the world of her youth, which was filled with these strange tribal rites. But now it seems beautiful and old and somehow touching. And this is a great story again because of the compassion that she feels in it. And there are two old people in this story, and they both sort of lived past their sell-by date. And this is Anson Morley thinking of the woman, poor old Evelina Jasper. In his youth, she had been New York's chief entertainer, leading hostess, the newspapers called her. Her big house at Fifth Avenue had been an entertaining machine. She had lived, breathed, invested, and reinvested her millions to no other end. At first, her pretext had been that she had to marry her daughters and amuse her sons, but whose sons and daughters had married and left her. She had just gone on entertaining. Hundreds, no thousands of dinners, on gold plate, of course, and with orchids, and all the delicacies that were out of season had been served in that vast, pompous dining room. So she sets you up to believe that poor old Evelina is simply a figure of fun. but in fact, Wharton becomes more and more engaged by the sadness of becoming this sort of forgotten figure whose mind has left her, but she is helplessly following these rituals. And then this is her maid in her dressing room. She looked almost reluctantly about the big, high-studded dressing room. Everything in the house was high-studded, with its rich, dusty carpet and curtains, and its monumental dressing table draped with lace and laden with gold-backed brushes and combs, gold stoppered toilet bottles, and all the charming paraphernalia of beauty at her glass. Old Lavinia, that's her servant, even renewed every morning with roses and carnations in the slim crystal vases between the powder boxes and the nail polishers. Since the family had shut down the hothouses at an uninhabited country place on the Hudson, Miss Crest suspected that old Lavinia bought these flowers out of her own pocket. And that's what Wharton does, is bring you, the reader, into an awareness of the secret connections that are made in this world. In this case, it's between the old woman and her maid who loves her. So she is revealing aspects of this world that she never saw 30 years earlier, never could understand. And then the final story, which is one of her great masterpieces, Roman Fever, is about two matrons who, it's written 3 years before she died, 1934, about two matrons who were neighbors in New York, never liked each other, always were wary and suspicious of each other, and are now sitting in Rome on a rooftop watching the afternoon fade and talking about their two daughters who are about the same age. And one of them is deeply envious of the other. And it turns out that the story turns on this tale moment of incredible betrayal of one woman for the other. Actually, they each betray each other. But they're also, the mild, meek woman, it turns out, has betrayed the social tradition in a way that horrifies and enrages the other way. So she ends her writing life with this extraordinary story of rage, illicit sex, betrayal, deception. It's this triumphant sort of concerto that she creates about New York, tradition, social convention, and these incredibly powerful, pulsing emotions. She saw these two forces in absolute antagonism to each other, the rules and the emotions. And really that's what most of her writing is about, rules and emotions. And one reason that her work is so incredibly powerful is that the rules were so powerful. And so the emotions had to be violent and volcanic and tumultuous in order to overwhelm them. So, oh yeah, I'm supposed to talk about New York now. Well, the rules are no longer so important. But I've given you an overview of work. We'll go on to something else. So,
Elizabeth Hardwick lived in Times Square hotels, Morningside Heights, brimming houses, and in 1949 got married. She left New York for 12 years. And in a manic fit in 1961, Robert Lowell agreed to exchange their capacious Marlborough Street house in Boston for Eric Bentley's cramped place on Riverside Drive on 101st Street. Lizzie was furious, but coming back to New York meant everything for her as a writer. Soon they found a home on West 67th Street, close to Central Park, and one of those primitive 20th century apartment houses expressly designed with painters in mind. Her living room was framed by a great two-story window admitting a northern light. In the 1970s, when I first knew her, she, a divorced woman, a single mother, was nostalgic for the great anti-war demonstrations in the park, the sounds of which she remembered bouncing down the street up to their windows. You cannot learn unless you fall in love with the source of learning, Alfred North Whitehead said, and for years I wrote the ballads of Lizzie Shell's past mock as the Dutch Republic and the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica. She thought it was a scream that Joan Hurston had been Fanny Hurst's secretary just around the corner on West 66th Street. The things one could hear in her living room. One night I was very aware that she and Barbara Epstein and Susan Sontag were talking in a way that they would not have had any of the men in their lives been present. They were free and inviting. I thought of that passage in Colette's The Pure and the Impure, when she remembers her bondage as a ghostwriter to her husband. She recalls with gratitude her husband's male secretary and his circle of flamboyant friends who talked about their romances and didn't care if she listened. The same thing was happening to me, I remember telling myself. I don't know why I recall this as an important New York moment, but the city somehow confirmed or reflected or anticipated the experiences related in my reading. This could only have happened to me here. Ever since, I've always expected books to be true, so to speak. Lizzie was surprised that I didn't like the stories of Catherine Porter's collection, The Leaning Tower, set in the post-Civil War South ruin, and preferred the title story set in Berlin in 1931. A struggling artist from Texas was counting his pennies. He's a drip, she interrupted, and said that Catherine Ann's interconnected stories about a woman and her former slave in their old age exposed the white person's fantasy that the black man has always loved him or her. I said I hated ruralism. What is Mark's expression, the idiocy of rural life? I hated folklore. I hated countrified settings for fiction. What was countrified about Faulkner, she wanted to know. I loved urban realism, I said, those Zola and Balzac novels of the city that she had urged on me. Dostoevsky and Gogol and the socially marginal in cold St. Petersburg. I think I had Grace Paley's collection of New York stories, The Little Disturbances of Man, but I don't remember what Lizzie said about it. I do remember that she pointed out that New York-born Nathaniel West may have grown up in an anglicized household, and maybe some East European gloom was in his writing, but its weirdness came entirely from his own head. His first novel was set in the Trojan horse's ass, after all. One's background and circumstances didn't have to determine the content, at least not in the obvious ways. We argued over why she thought the autobiographical writings of Richard Wright and James Baldwin were superior to their fiction, and why this might be so for all black writers, and had Ralph Ellison really taken things a step higher. I said she read Invisible Man as allegory, not as documentary history. She said I should discover Harlem, but one of the things that impressed her about the early novels of Gail Jones was that there didn't even seem to be a black side of town in them. As I look back, I see that when I knew Lizzie, her relationship to the city had changed. No way was she ever going to Harlem again. She who had smiled feebly when Billie Holiday made some anti-Semitic remark in the middle of a rant about some past manager. She never once came to the West Side apartment I lived in for 10 years before I moved to Berlin. I hate the Upper West Side, she said. Midtown is my idea. And she was very pleased at first that her street was being developed, that ABC was taking over the parking lots, even if that meant no more sun. We went off into Lincoln Center, just up the street, or over to Carlisle to sit absolutely smashed in front of Ellis Larkin and Bobby Short. She never went downtown or to Brooklyn. She was not a bohemian adventurer like Susan, off to see the latest avant-garde theater from Poland. And she was not a deep anarch like her best friend Barbara Epstein, who took no shit from cops, and was quite prepared to get arrested, and over whether Barbara could hail a taxi in the middle of traffic. Then, when Lizzie was older and afraid of falling, the busy street was an affliction. She missed the stables that had been torn down to make a condo. By then, her knowledge of what the city looked like came in large part from television and print. She read all the New York magazines, and for years she followed Mary Kempton's columns, in which the city often featured as his beat. She adored his prose style, his moral rigor, and his sense of history. As a writer in New York, she had a lively sense of the city's history, and was interested in the Civil War draft riots, the conditions under which free blacks lived in antebellum times, in Jane Jacobs's predictions, in Charles Francis and Henry Adams's chapters of Erie, in E.L. Doctorow, and of course in Henry James. Her notebooks filled with lines from the American scene, a diffused, wasted clamor of detonations. Bartleby the Scrivener wasn't history, but it had something to do with the soul of New York. In her mind, her characters had antecedents. The notebooks in the folder of fiction ideas, fiction attempts that she left behind were interesting, for the story she was trying to tell in the early 70s following the collapse of her marriage. Infidelity, divorce, property, she was writing about these streams from the perspective of a certain class and age, but she could never bring her thoughts together or find a way to unite the fragments, or sustain the story of her character. These pages show her trying out the voice that would give Sleepless Nights its beauty and fluency. In these pages, the city is the abandoned woman's ally. In 1973, she published in the New York Review of Books something she called Writing a Novel. And it was such an intense opening of a novel that Stuart Hampshire said, I don't see how you can go on from that, and in a way she couldn't. And then after Robert Lowell died, she took this chapter and simply opened it all out and filled in the rest, so that the structure had been there all along, but it took her a long time to sort of relax and find it. After Lowell died, she went back to writing fiction in the first person, and then tried to sort of make a novel about New York, which she was never able to do. But these are just some fragments from her notebook, because what life can fragments have is that to be shared from sometimes time to time. What sort of plot was contained the subject of the city? The bookstore is plundered. A cigarette fell into a basket. Fortunately, it had been emptied of paper, and so the burning cigarette lay there on only one piece of paper that covered the bottom, so that ashes would not seep through to the floor, and that piece burned quickly, and the straw was seared black. That was all. Good news, Henry said. Very good news. If I could ever understand what this state is, the love without love, this life in the air so heavy and yet so dear. There are sounds on the stairway. If I were walking in the Louvre and all the footsteps of tourists were tapping out on the marble floor, those footsteps I would know. There she is, there she is. This is going to be a long evening. What am I thinking about? I will not be talking about. Aren't my eyes looking odd? Feverish, as they would say about Raskolnikov when he was walking along the street before or after the crime. Second plot. I came here in 1960, yes, to my small little retreat where I meant to live quietly, as they say in old novels. It is a strange place, stranger than you would think. The man was shot by his wife up in Connecticut, and even though she had not seen him for 2 years, nor had a telephone call, she was brought into it. Out of control indeed. She was brought in to say, I have not seen that man for 2 years, nor have I heard from him. At last she was released, but he had transferred his guilt to her. How to use cinematic technique, interviewing, but how would the narrator know? What does the narrator do? Just look. That won't work. I hate making things up. Could one imagine a lot of characters and just have it told in a general way, not confined to the street, the apartment house, some central situation? Try this for a change. Manhattan, Manhattanism. Testimonies are not on every tongue, and yet pastoral pink-cheeked Whitman hangs about like a neon sign blinking on the Palisades. Whitman, a street person of unshockable appetite, not a family man. Oh, such for me, oh, an intense life, full to repletion and varied. There he is, the mortal blue of his eyes glimmering with age, the darker blue, the flat-tinned sheen of his windbreaker, the sludging moccasins lined with felt. There he is at the filthy kiosk in front of the 72nd Street subway station, his mind filled with the pure prose of the newest edition of the Daily News. There is much to think about in the paper. It is all there. What is wonderful in New York is that nothing is hidden. There are no secrets, no mysteries, only imaginative and yet banal fantasies that transform so confidently the obvious. You see, it is not true that the miserable old lady has money in the bank, uncashed checks in the drawer, stocks hidden under the mattress. The old lady hasn't anything at all, except a small visible pension. Still, the elevator man is certain she could buy and sell all of us. Buy and sell, he says of her. Odd that the notion of disregarded or hoarded monies should have come about because of the old lady's genuine destitution, her dramatic thinness and shabbiness. Her riches are thought to be growing out of the dirt, as if they were a sort of manure, wonderfully good for making the soil healthy. So, she thought about New York all the time. It saved her as a woman in her life.
My idea of New York comes more from the movies than from novels. well, the first time I came to New York City, that was 1975, and I felt when I was crossing the city with the bus from the airport, I felt I already knew the streets, the buildings. When I went down to catch the train, I already knew all that because I've seen all of those items all my life, when I was a kid, watching movies in black and white, in Frank Capra's movies, but in movies with Italian immigrants, with Jewish immigrants. It was all movies were American, and part of America is not New York, but to us, I don't know why, the most part of the movies were set in New York. If you realize that that scene of the movie where there's Christmas and there's Macy's and you see the street and all that's a kind of little rain that goes to your head every day. And apart from movies, was the music. I don't know, when I found, in 1982 I came to New York and I found that there really was a club which was called The Mad on White Street. I was astonished because it was a club, a local bar that I already knew by Frank Zappa's song. So it was discovering that everything I had listened to and seen was kind of real. It was the 80s, the punk movement that had a lot to do with the United Kingdom, but also with New York, was almost dead. But of course, I had read stories about New York. Not the classics, not Henry James, things like that, because I have never studied. I began working at 14, so I went from primary school to work, and all I did was reading, because it was not allowed. I mean, it was something like TV nowadays, when you see a family and there's that kid always watching TV and don't watch more TV because you became an idiot. Well, that's what my mother always said to me when I used to read a lot when I was a kid and was young. But I had to hide the fiction book under the mathematics book. Because when I saw her coming, I had to because she always said, reading, you read so many novels, that you became me. She was right. But this, I have a villa in New York. My villa in New York is Truman Capote and Dorothy Parker. I love those stories of music for chameleons. Some of the stories doesn't happen in New York, but some others, they do. The one when he goes, he has a small pot with his not famous. Cleaning. Well, that's New York, and that's I mean, not the pot thing, but the way he describes his relation with the cleaning lady and all the story with Marilyn Monroe, is that true or he invented it? I don't know, but those wandering, looking for a bar to have champagne, and then finding Chinese restaurant, which seems like they weren't prepared to bring champagne at that time of the day. But well, to me that's New York. Apart from, well, in Dorothy Parker, I translated some of her stories years ago, and the description of the city made me think about a city that, well, I'm more or less found when I came here. There's a book about New York which is called Fairy Tale of New York by J.P. Donnelly, that also gave me an idea of the city. And then there's those books, when Tom Wolfe, before trying to be a Balzac, was the head of the chief of the New Journal, he wrote a lot of reportage about trendy people in New York and the leftist, exclusive leftist, and well, that was also New York for me. Years later, then there was Polos, the Polos of New York City. I found that in New York, so some people think that Polos has some reservations. About him. But what the final view of New York is a picture of the city that a lot. But that was when I was growing up, and well, I already knew the city when I read those books. Then there's Salinger. Salinger's stories, the ones that he allowed to be published. And then the other stories, the one that he doesn't allow to be published, but that you can find in the internet easily. And there's 50, 60 short stories that I could offer you my left arm to write one of those short stories, but he didn't ever wanted to see them published. Well, the difference, one of the points you asked for in the paper, when you said, oh, you have to talk about this, talk about that, was the between that New York idea, or the literary New York, or the movie New York that you have to create an idea of, and the real one. Well, that's the difference. And I think, at least for the kind of fiction I like, there has to be a difference. Because one thing is life and the other is literature. It would be terrible if books were as flat as reality is. But that's my opinion. I mean, there's people that like that literature is the exact picture of life. But I don't know, when you live, you get up in the morning, you see your face, you say, wow, what a nice man. And you shave yourself, and but if you, when you write, if need be, you can make a man fly. And if it has been done properly. I mean, you have to do it properly because if not, nobody can believe that a man can fly. You believe it, and to me that's the difference, or that's the point of the literature. I remember a great story about Charles Baxter, which is called The Cliff, where a man, which is a boy to fly, he has become too old and can't fly anymore. And they are at the verge of a cliff, and then the boy has still the innocence that will allow him to fly if he learns how. And that's the mission of the old man. That's a fascinating story, and that's, as far as I know, it's something important in real life. Unless, I don't know, it is the terrestrials that Stephen Hawking has warned us about a couple of days ago arrive and they teach us how to do it. I think the cities are never exactly as they, literary cities are never as they are in real life. Barcelona, the city where I'm from, is not the way you read about it in the books. Especially if this city is written with the interest of making it trendy one way or another. French literary people had during the whole last century a great penchant for typical Barcelona that meant Barriocchino, prostitutes, the 50s, the Franco regime, that guy André Pierre de Mandiares was a great example of this kind of name-dropping writer. I mean, a street's name-dropping writer, which means, and then we arrived to La Rambla, and so this and so that, and then we went to... Is there really a need to say that was that street or the other? The same happened to me with New York. Sometimes I think, I don't care if it's this street or the other, or even if it's New York or not. One example of this street's name dropping writer is Hemingway. I hate Hemingway. He has a novel which is called The Sun Also Rises. I think here in the States it was published as Fiesta, or the other way around, I don't know. In the United Kingdom it was called Fiesta, and here The Sun Also Rises. And the plot happens in Pamplona. He fills Pamplona with cliches to satisfy his American readers, fond of cliches about Pamplona or the lions or the Reno chase or whatever. He even makes the characters in the novel speak kind of Spanish that sometimes it has no sense. Anyway, what was the 30s or the 40s? And well, a few people here, or few of those American readers who know cliches, knew if this was the exit sentence or not. That the same happens to New York. I really don't care about location. If it happens in New York or Cincinnati, if the story is good and well written, it doesn't matter. I love Dorothy Parker and Truman Capote and Saladin, but not because the setting is in New York. And what else? Apart from the fact that in this kind of fiction that I like, the one that steps apart from the strict reality, There's a lot of stories that you don't know what will happen. I'm very fond of Lydia Davis stories. I love her. But all the stories by Shirley Jackson. But do they have anything, you know? Maybe or maybe not. Should I have included them in my list of New York literary references? I don't know. That's it. No.
Well, we have time for maybe 2 questions. All right.
I would like to ask Quim Monzó, if I pronounced your name correctly, the selection in this from your novel Gasoline, 1983, refers to a painting by Edwin Hopper, Nighthawks, and I'm curious to know, before 1983, where you discovered the painting Nighthawks. This is before the internet. You had already come to New York. Anyway, what did Hopper mean to you in terms of, what did Hopper mean to you? Why Hopper?
Good question.
Okay. Well, how I find it, I don't know, but the only studies I had were as a painter. And, well, that picture is, I don't know, I think I knew that picture since I was 9 or 10 years old. Because I used to buy art books. I love art and plastic art. And well, I used to steal money from my mother to buy. Yeah, but that's true. I did something like that. And well, I discovered when I was 9, 10 years, and that. All of his paintings are great, but this one has something special. It's the solitude of the characters, that man with the hat, the letters, the situation, the weight. It's so sad. I discovered it then. Give me 30 years since 10 until 30. 30 years to write.
Anything else?
If you have a couple questions, just you can ask the panel. We have
I have another one. I wondered if I'm correct, until Franco's death, Catalan was a suppressed language under Franco. Did America and American movies represent some sort of symbol of freedom? Is that particularly why they appeal to you in Barcelona?
So those are 2 questions.
One question
Okay.
is about the relationship of suppression of Catalan language to issues of freedom, where they did something about America seemed to represent freedom that you didn't have.
Well, I think that's, well, I'll answer you in 2 different, 2 times. First one, Catalan was the official language until Franco did the coup d'etat, and then it was over for 40 years. So it was absolutely forbidden. That's one thing. But the other thing is American movies as freedom. No, not especially. There were the movies we saw at theaters. There were European movies too, but there were more American movies than European movies. You had more money, more power, more movies. there's no relation between what you can make a movie and a sense of freedom to me.
Thank you.
Yeah, up there. I'll go.
Yes, okay, Lyndon, I think
Yeah.
thinking about what you said about Wharton and James and the trajectory all the way to Hardwick and stopping at Henry going a long way, is anger and rage an essential element in writing about New York? It seems that it's, you know, it unchanged over a century, you know, worth of writing about New York. And I'm trying to think, as you're talking about books where I thought, okay, are there books where anger and rage is not a key element in that sort of narrative? I mean, what do you think?
Any happy New York books?
I suppose if you were offering a gift to a novelist, it would be to take the place of childhood and to erase it, and to build skyscrapers on it, to destroy it in every possible way. So the village atmosphere that fed the talent, fed the imagination, was obliterated, and therefore lived only in the mind. And therefore, the whole disturbance surrounding that obviously would produce anger on visits or on contemplation. But the other part of that would be a great gift, which would be then to free the writer somehow. That the house you lived in has been destroyed, and the house of fiction will be built to A, recreate it, but perhaps more importantly, replace it. So the anger is just an aside. The anger is an aside issue. What comes in James mainly is the sense of architecture, the sense of creation, the sense of almost replacing that with something so visibly and clearly perfectly made and perfectly sort of executed that, but that almost was necessary, the destruction of the initial village in which the boy walked.
And I'd also say about Edith Wharton that The Age of Innocence is a celebration of New York. It's a celebration of the world that she grew up in. It's deeply respectful, and it really honors that world more than it honors the people who struggle within that beautiful page. But she's writing with deep, deep respect for a world that protected itself, protected its own institutions, and they were important ones. She says in The Age of Innocence, the world, the tradition of marriage. Marriage is a sacred institution, and it must be protected. And that's something that she looks back at, and it was something she was unable to do, but she feels a deep sense of honor and dignity about that world. So I think she sort of spans the whole spectrum of rage and a sense of constriction and disappointment and a feeling of being an outsider. And then at the end, later in her life, she wasn't an outsider in France. She was an absolute insider. She had money by then. She was not expected to get married. She wasn't 22 looking for a husband. She was a very highly respected woman of letters. She had a very highly respected place in French society. And she looked back at something that now seemed a great gift to her, which was her family, the way families moved through that world of New York, and the way they protected the world that they had made and which they cherished.
I think there's also one other point. James was intensely jealous of Wharton.
She was a bestseller. She wrote bestseller.
And besides the fact that she had a car, and he had a car, as I pointed out, but also that she knew New York, that she had a world that she had grown up in. He had left at 12, so he had no sense of how the society functioned. I mean, what he wouldn't have given to plant even the world, you know, Elizabeth Hardwick came to know so well, those streets, those people, you know, much later, and also Wharton's family and her roots in the city. Then he was, as a novelist, ruthless, and he felt this very deeply. Certainly when he came across her and realised just how well she knew her world and how little he knew. So that in Washington Square, you really had to place most of the novel in the psychology of Catherine Sloper and in the interior of grandmother's house, because the city and its people, the social life of the city, he genuinely didn't know.
In the last work in the New York story of Elizabeth Hardwick, it's a about the random violence of the city. But otherwise, New York was a place of refuge for Elizabeth and a place where you met other people who had escaped someplace or had a reason for coming to New York, whether it's distinguished refugees from Germany in her early stories from the Partisan Review, or the marginal people in the rooming houses who wanted her sympathy, things like that. A city sort of big enough to lose yourself in and to find yourself again, a place where you recreate the self, which is more interesting.
You know, it's interesting that James is the one who seems to see the city as a place that everything in America has to escape, glaring the absence of history. So, and yet, as you say, it's also something that in escaping it, he's left something behind that he very much yearns for.
Just another question about Edith Wharton. I've been to her house in Berkshires, and I'm just wondering, it was so beautiful, and she was in so much control there, from what I understand. She created her ideal environment. Did she ever make peace with New York when she became more well-known and felt like she was in control of her life?
Well, as I was saying in the Age of Innocence, that's her great elegy to New York. I think she very much came to a sense of reconciliation with it. And then after Holbein, the one about the two old people, just very moving and very beautiful, and celebrates and sort of unveils those ceremonies that old New York performed. The ritual of the dinner party, the butler announcing the guests, the gold plate, the orchids brought from the hothouses, and the servants who loved the people they worked for, and the people whose servants they were loved the servants. So there's a tremendous sense of community that she.
But I mean New York in the 1920s, not in that period that she was writing.
She didn't come back, really. And that was another thing that both James and Wharton shared, the sense that, and I really think her greatest work is written about New York and America. She tried to write about the 20s, and I don't think those books are very successful, or the stories. She really didn't know what was going on. She thought she did. She wrote about people getting divorces and driving fast cars and going on wild trips, but she didn't really understand the people, and I don't think she got it. But she really, her great, what she could draw on, her treasure as a writer, was her life before she left America, before 1911. And everything really referred later to that. And so her feelings about it changed. She didn't come back to live here. And when she did come back, she didn't understand the city. Everything was different. There were cars, it was noisy, there were immigrants. Nothing was the same. She didn't understand it at all. So she was much better off mining that earlier vein, loving the city where she had hated it, but she never got to write sensibly. Well, the Roman fever, but that's really set later, but it's still New York from an earlier period.
I'm just I can't defend the Nigger Boxer and the Sun Also Rises, but I can see you're feeling really sorry for Hemingway. I want to speak up for in his time the Nick Adams stories. Hemingway, Salinger, Carver have a lot to do with the sound of American literature in the 20th century. You know, Hemingway doesn't get a lot of credit because everything sounded like him immediately.
I know we have a lot more questions, but we've run a little over, and I hope you will meet all the writers in our education center, which is just adjacent to the auditorium lobby. Please give all of our writers and panelists a round